Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. Russian lawmakers are currently debating the age of criminal responsibility in Russia. The current age of 16 may be reduced to 12, but doubts are being voiced over whether such an age is synonymous with full awareness and responsibility. Stories of violent crimes such as rape and murder are starring younger and younger Russian teenagers. Some officials in Russia say that a 14-year-old's liability should be dropped to 12 and full criminality reduced to 14. Those tabling the changes say that such offenders should be isolated from the public despite their age, and that the juvenile court system in Russia is ineffective. The people challenging the changes say that jail is no place for a child that does not understand the severity of their crime. Some activists argue that jail is not the solution and that child offenders should be subject to mandatory education instead. Even if Russia does lower the age of criminal responsibility to 14, it will not be the lowest in the world. In India and Singapore, children as young as 7 can be put behind bars, and in the UK that age is set at 10 years old. To find out more about the age of criminality and to discuss the changes on the table, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Nicholas Mackintosh from the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Cambridge, Nikhil Roy, Programme Development Director at Penal Reform International, and on the line Jonathan Taylor, who's with the Metropolitan Police Service for 30 years and is now a criminal psychology specialist and child protection expert. We spoke to the Ministry of Justice yesterday in Britain about changing the age of criminal responsibility. They issued a statement which reads, "The government is not currently considering raising the age of criminal responsibility. The government believes children aged 10 are able to differentiate between bad behaviour and serious wrongdoing." Anyone can jump in first. Do you think this is a fair stance for the government to take on this issue? Do you think it's right?
Thank you. There are a number of reasons why the UK government should be actively looking at raising the age of criminal responsibility. For one thing, Britain is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's quite explicitly stated there that the age of criminal responsibility should be set at as high a level as is practical and in line with the best interests of the child. In 2007, the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued in its General Comment number 10 a further guidance saying that the age needs to be increased. This is globally, not just in the UK, as a global guideline. The age needs to be increased around the world and should, in any case, never be less than 12 and should be higher wherever possible and is desirable. And I think UK has an obligation under the convention and in terms of following the guidelines of the committee, as well as looking at good practice in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world where the age has been set significantly higher, including in large parts of the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on, where the age is much higher. I'll come back to talk about why the age by itself is not the only determinant in kind of looking at how a juvenile justice system is functioning, but it is an important determinant, and in that respect, the UK is behind international trends.
We know that internationally there seems to be little consensus as to what the age should be in terms of criminal responsibility, but why is there so much disparity? We know that in India and Singapore it can be as low as 7. Meanwhile, in other countries it can be up to 18. Why do you think that's the case?
There is clear guidance from the Committee on the Rights of the Child on this matter. So in terms of the disparity, I think it's individual governments, taking positions in terms of, how they want to implement it. But once you've signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and once you are, in that system, which every country, bar 2 in the world, have signed, they have ratified, so they have an obligation to actually look at the age of criminal responsibility and to raise it. Now, a number of countries have not done this, and they've set it very low. But again, as I said, it's not the only determinant. So if you look at Scotland, for example, which has historically had a low age, which has only been revised recently, But the Scottish system has always been a model in many ways for allowing children who are in conflict with the law to be dealt with outside of the formal criminal justice system. So even if you have a low age of criminal responsibility, you could have a system which allows for better protection of children. So it's not the only determinant, but of course it provides an important insight into what's going on with protecting children who are in conflict with the law.
And yeah, I don't know if I can come in there. I tend to agree with that. We talk about the age of responsibility, but if you break that down, it has to be looked at. Do we believe that a child at age 9 or 10 or 11, we always argue whether they know right from wrong. But I think one of the biggest issues here is how it's actually dealt with. I totally agree. When you look at Scotland, everybody talks about they've increased it to 12. Well, they have, but it doesn't mean anybody between 8 and 12 isn't actually committing a criminal offence. It's just how they're dealt with by this child discipline panel. I think that's very important to understand that each case is actually dealt with on an individual basis, because a child of 8, 9, 10 or 11, their sort of cognitive behaviour can be completely different to another sibling of the same age. But how they're dealt with by society and also the legal system is very, very important, especially when we consider what must be considered here is the victims. There's too much talk about the actual offender. We must understand what part the victim plays in this. And as with a lot of countries, as in with the UK, restorative justice, that has been proven to actually work very effectively.
Did you want to come in here, Nicholas?
Yes, for the Department of Justice just to sort of sit pat and say we have no intention of changing it and we're not going to even bother to explain why it is 10 in England, which is significantly lower than practically any other European country. That seems to me unreasonable. At the very least, English lawmakers should be willing to explain why they think they've got it right and other countries have got it wrong. The fact is that the law does not treat adolescents as fully mature adults. You are not allowed to drive a car on the public highway until you're 17. You're not allowed to vote until you're 18. Of course, 10-year-olds know the difference between right and wrong in some sense, although they may well not agree with adults as to what is right and what is wrong. But the fact is that we know, neuroscientists know, psychologists know, parents know that adolescents are not fully mature adults. They don't behave like adults, and a 10-year-old certainly doesn't behave like an adult and doesn't think like an adult and should not be treated as an adult. If they are to be, then it needs explaining why.
And I know you've done a lot of work in this particular area, the psychological reasons why a 10-year-old can't be held fully responsible. Could you explain some of the science behind that?
Well, some of the science is actually neuroscience. I mean, contrary to the received opinion of about 20, 30 years ago, the brain continues developing throughout adolescence. And the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making, impulse control, is actually the last part of the brain to become fully mature, carries on maturing until at least the age of 20. And we recognize that. The adolescents do not behave like mature adults. And the law already recognizes that for some purposes. Why it should think that 10-year-olds are fully mature adults, as far as the criminal justice system is concerned, is something that needs justifying.
And just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. John, I think if I could turn to you and just ask, what's the media's role in all of this, in creating a perception that the age should remain where it is, or even indeed be increased? I mean, some specialists have criticised the media perception of young people, claiming that the media portrays them as part of a wider gang culture, and possibly the issue is bigger than it really is. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, well, again, the world that I actually operate in at the moment is the online world. And if you look at a 10-year-old 20 years ago compared to a 10-year-old these days, it's what's happening with the social media, with the fact that they're growing up very quickly. Everything evolves, and that includes, in my opinion, the behaviour of young children. if you imagine what can be seen and what can be experienced in the online world, it tends to actually spill over to the offline world. And I go back to the fact that, you've got 10, 11-year-olds who are able to understand what they're doing is a criminal offence. Now, what was previously said, we shouldn't just simply say that, research has shown that the adolescents, they're not as mature as adults, so they shouldn't be dealt with as adults. Fine. Then perhaps what should be changed is how they're dealt with, not just believing that 10, 11, 12-year-olds cannot commit criminal offences because they don't know what they're doing. I think that's very, very dangerous, especially the way the society is now, that we have this online world and we have a spills over to the offline world. Children very, very young, as soon as they can go onto the internet, they can experience any aspect of life, whether that's the good part of life or whether that's the bad part of life. I spend all my time talking about the internet dangers. And, of course, children, very young children, can see this because they're not policed and it's not moderating. And that's where their understanding of the world, it comes from these days. It's not just from parenting. It's actually from the internet. And that's very dangerous, but it also gives us the ability to say, well, they probably do understand from what they've seen that carrying a gun, carrying a knife, or actually using these type of weapons actually is bad. It is a criminal offence. They might not know, say, it's definitely a criminal offence per se, but they'll know they shouldn't be doing it. But then it spills over to how they should be dealt with by society and the legal system. Whether the legal system should explain why they're not going to do it, well, yes, but a lot of things don't get explained by whether it's the justice system or whoever. But we have to accept that a 10-year-old today is completely different to a 10-year-old of, say, 20 years ago. Well, 1993, perhaps, when it was actually changed.
I agree that the important issue is how young children are dealt with when they break the law. Of course, they do break the law, and they should indeed face some consequences of their actions. But the notion that a 10-year-old can understand what's going on in a criminal court seems to me absurd. They don't understand what's happening. It's quite clear.
Can I just add something, which is that there is a step before you look at children breaking the law. I agree that children break. Of course, we're not talking about angels here. So I mean, there are real issues which are happening on the streets in society, and we know this. So the first question is, what is being done in order to prevent, before this comes to the stage where there is action on the street, in terms of conflict with the law and breaking of the law. Earlier this year, Penal Reform International put out a 10-point plan to help address issues relating to how you can promote better justice for children. And the very first point that we have in this is to establish a crime prevention strategy. And this is something that's internationally sort of accepted as being a way in terms of how do you, look at, vulnerable groups, how do you look at sort of prevention programs, how do you put in place, measures which can actually target groups who are likely to be offenders as they go forward. Now,
so you're looking at changing the environment as opposed to changing
as one of the
root causes,
as one of the ways in which, as I said, I mean, there's a variety of measures which need to be. It's a package basically, and age of criminal responsibility is one of them. But having a prevention strategy in place is another. Having in place diversion measures so that you don't go through judicial proceedings, but actually have either family group conferencing, or you have a special child-friendly ways of disposing of cases. There are ways of doing this which make it much easier to deal with the children. Training for key sort of stakeholders in the justice system is another. So I mean, all of these together make up a package which allows for proper rolling out of a justice system which will help children, those who are under 18, not just to criminalize them and put them behind bars, throw away the key, and then say, look, we've resolved the problem, because you don't resolve the problem. These kids do come out. I mean, you don't, I mean, they come out at the age of, 25, whatever. And all the evidence shows that, those who've been through prison come out as hardened criminals. They are not, these are not sort of places where there is any change happening. So I think we need to look at that as well.
And just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. And today I'm talking to Professor Nicholas Mackintosh from the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Cambridge, Nikhil Roy, Programme Director at Penal Reform International, and Jonathan Taylor, a criminal psychology specialist and child protection expert. This is where Russia comes in, and there's considerable debate going on there as to whether the age of criminality should be lowered. And some lawmakers are tabling the option that a child as young as 14, for particularly vicious crimes such as rape and murder, can receive a life term in prison. Their argument is that they should just remove them from society. Can you see that happening in Britain?
A 14-year-old? No.
No. Why is that the case? Why is there so much disparity, do you think, between policies?
It's not a question of disparity in policies. I think Britain already has certain standards and guidelines and principles in place. What we are arguing is that these can be further improved. And one way to do that is to increase the age of criminal responsibility, to make sure that, Britain does have a problem in that it's locking up more children than anywhere else in Western Europe, not necessarily in the rest of the world. So it is behind in terms of trends, in Western Europe. I think in Russia you have a different problem because there is, much more pressure from the media. There is this, element, if you like, of, criminalization, that's going on within society. And I think children are being made to pay for the failures of politicians and the system. That's my view anyway. And I think you really need to sort of think of children as being an investment for the future rather than sort of, short-termism where you kind of pick up a 15-year-old and lock them up and say that, we're never going to let you out, because that is inhumane, that is against international principles, against international standards, and Russia is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So if they're going to do that, then they need to sort of really explain, how it is that they can sign up to a set of principles and then do what they're doing. So I would really argue that it's not a step in a desirable direction at all.
One of the criticisms of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that no specific age, has been agreed upon. Why is that? And do you think it's possible to agree internationally to a point where it's binding?
No, actually I don't. I mean, I think it's an arbitrary cutoff that any government is going to make. There's nothing magical about 12 or 14 or 16. You can argue for and against any of those positions. I think you can argue more strongly against 10, and you can probably say that no one really supposes that it should be greater than 18. But within that range, there's going to be disagreement.
The Convention defines a child as anyone under 18. So that's the first point, yeah? In terms of the age of criminal responsibility, when the convention was adopted in 1989, it said, it should be set as high age as possible. And as I say, in 2007, the Committee on the Rights of the Child had another look at this, and their exact statement was, states parties are encouraged to increase the age of criminal responsibility to the age of 12 years as the absolute minimum age, and to continue to increase it to a higher level. So there is acknowledgement that, 12 should be an absolute minimum, and that it should be moved upwards as well. And I agree that, you could argue that the age should actually be 18, and that one of the arguments that is made for helping children in conflict with the law is that you have a separate juvenile justice system altogether. So it doesn't matter whether you're 5 or 10 or 18, you're actually looking at children as children and trying to put in place, a package of measures which will help them to really come to grips with, their vulnerabilities, their, level of understanding, their socioeconomic backgrounds, so all of that needs to be looked at. And it doesn't matter whether you're 10 or 12 or 18. They have a right under the convention, and indeed under, what we owe them as society to really sort of be able to look at this as a package. So that's why I would argue that, the age is one determinant. And you obviously look at it because when you're looking at the justice system, it's a useful sort of reference point, if you like. But it's by no means the only reference point. And as I say, there should be a package in place which really allows for the children who are in contact or in conflict with the law to be dealt with appropriately.
One case in particular in 1993 was Jamie Bolger, which really the country won't quickly forget. It was particularly vicious. It involved John Venables and Robert Thompson, who were 10 at the time, and they snatched Jamie Bolger from Merseyside shopping centre. He was later found dead on a railway embankment 2 miles from there. His killers were tried and convicted in an adult court and contributed significantly to the ongoing debate on the age of criminality in this country. Many people at the time, and now actually, said that changing the age limit is not the answer. That's something you've mentioned before, and that those two killers should never have been prosecuted. How did it come about that they were prosecuted in an adult court then?
Because the law allowed it. And there was, of course, a slightly earlier case, that of Mary Bell, who, aged 10, murdered 2 small children. The media insist, don't they, on public prosecution of such children, when actually what they need is a different system that tries to understand what they thought they were doing and why they were doing it. And of course, in all 3 cases, they had been abused seriously as very young children. And that probably helps to explain why they did not fully comprehend that what they were doing was grossly immoral and illegal. We need to understand.
And I think the issue about the media is a very serious one, because I think if you look at it, I mean, how many 10-year-olds are running around the streets killing, either, children younger than them, or indeed, older children or adults, okay? You've had one Bolger case, and it's interesting you mention it, because it sticks in our memory, all right? And as I said right at the beginning, I mean, we're not talking about angels. These things happen. But how many of these cases? And I really think you need to look at them on a case-by-case basis and not have a sweeping kind of, one-size-fits-all, in response to what is an individual case. And the case had its particularities, as has been mentioned, in terms of the backgrounds of the children, in terms of, what they'd been through and so on. And if you look at what's happened to them subsequently, we know the reports that there have been attempts at they've had to be moved in the prisons in which they were kept. There've been attempts to take their own life. In one case. So I mean we know that prison has not actually addressed that issue, and it hasn't brought the young child back. I mean so we've actually we wasted 3 lives in a sense. And we shouldn't be doing that.
Just to go back to your point about understanding, at the time there seemed to be very little understanding as to how this, and sympathy as to how they were seen as products of their environment. They came from very harsh and almost deprived backgrounds, but very few people in the public domain could understand that. And do you think that speaks of a wider public sort of mindset that needs to be changed towards the age of criminality in the UK?
Well, the public need to understand the horrendous consequences of early childhood abuse. And we don't understand that. The public demonises 10-year-olds and wants to lock them up and throw away the key without any desire to understand what was happening and why it happened.
Do you think it's a broader, basic psychological misunderstanding that people aren't born evil?
Some people are born probably slightly more evil than others. I'm not trying to pretend that all newborn babies are saints in the making. Of course they're not. Some children are nastier than others, and some are more easily persuaded or bullied or whatever into criminal behaviour. I don't doubt that for a moment. But it's part of the problem is the thirst for vengeance, isn't it? And of course one can only sympathise, and that's an inadequate word, with the parents of Jamie Bulger and with the parents of the 2 babies that Mary Bell murdered. Of course that's terrible for them, and nothing will bring back their murdered babies. But just locking up the perpetrators and throwing away the key without any attempt to understand what was happening and why it happened isn't going to help anyone either.
And unfortunately, we've run out of time for today's discussion. Can I say thank you to my guests, Professor Nicholas Mackintosh from Cambridge University, Nikhil Roy from Penal Reform International, and Jonathan Taylor, a criminal psychology specialist.